I'm Roxane PHOTINODELLIS. I'm in my second year of my PhD in environmental economics. I'm under the direction of Laure Bamière and Stéphane de Cara. Today, I will present you my thesis topic. It's called Cost-effectiveness of land-based management options to mitigate agricultural GHG emissions in France. France is committed to the Paris agreements. To contribute to this, France has set herself the objectives of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 at the national scale. Carbon neutrality is defined as the balance between anthropogenic GHG emissions and carbon sequestration in soils and biomass. The agricultural sector is one of few sectors to have the capacity to sequester carbon, especially thanks to its soils. And at the same time, agriculture is the second highest emitting sector in France, representing around 17% of the national emissions. The main GHGs are methane, which come from livestock, and nitrogen linked to soil fertilization. At the sector level, the mitigation targets are an 18% abatement of net GHG emission in 2030 compared to 2015 GHG emissions and 46% in 2050. But how to reduce net GHG emissions in the agricultural sector? To mitigate GHG emissions and sequester carbon, it's possible to modify the production system by modifying the land allocation, the herd size, the use inputs such as fertilizer, the composition of the cattle feed rations, etc. And it's also possible to mitigate with uptaking technical practices like no-till, develop methanization, extend the grazing period, etc. For clarity, we will call with the same name the technical practices and the modification of production system, which are mitigation practices. At the French level, these two studies show that GHG mitigation and soil sequestration is costly to farmers. That this is why most of these practices are not currently adopted, like agroforestry. So it is necessary to put in place economic instruments like payments, subsidies or taxes to encourage their adoption and thus achieve the mitigation objective set. The chosen instrument must be as cost-effective as possible. That is to say that it can to achieve the objectives at the lowest cost. But how to define an effective and cost-effective regulatory instrument, knowing that these four elements, trade-offs between practices reducing emission and our carbon sequestering practices, particular characteristics of carbon sequestration, heterogeneity because of pedoclimatic condition, and uncertainties about cost and mitigation potential of practices. I will describe you these four elements a little more. For trade-offs between practices reducing emission and or carbon sequestering practices, for example, a tax on GHG emissions could destock carbon soil and have a strong impact on farmers' profits compared to other solutions. A tax on GHG emissions could lead to decrease in the herd. It will increase the opportunity cost of conserving grassland. The grassland will then be returned to crop. The carbon stocked in the grassland will be destocked. New crops will need more nitrogen than grassland, and this will increase N2O emissions. So it is necessary to take into account the net GHG balance and the interactions between the various levels of sequestration and GHG emissions in order to adopt the most effective strategies to mitigate GHG in agricultural sector. particular characteristic of carbon sequestration. Carbon sequestration in soil is not permanent. This means that when a sequestration process is stopped, the trapped carbon is released into the atmosphere. Each practice then has finite and limit potential for sequestration, and carbon sequestration is a dynamic process that an exponential trajectory at the beginning of the adoption of practice before gradually reaching its limit. The mitigation of carbon sequestration practice is deployed progressively and not immediately. So, with this element lead to questions: how to consider the dynamics of sequestration, how to encourage the carbon sequestration in a sustainable way, and when to implement which practice, since the potential of carbon sequestering practices is heterogeneous over time. For heterogeneity because of pedoclimatic condition, the abatement potential and cost of practices depend on the pedoclimatic conditions. As the cost and mitigation potential of the practices are not the same everywhere, this can lead to high monitoring costs. A net GHG tax will perhaps be the most effective options, but will be too costly from the point of view of monitoring. So these elements lead to questions: what second-best policy to put in place in order to achieve the fixed mitigation and save on monitoring costs. For uncertainties, the spatial heterogeneity of cost and mitigation potential is at the origin of a great variability of this data, which creates a lot of uncertainties. The biochemical, physical, and climatic phenomena at the origin of the emission and the sea sequestration are complex, and we currently have a representation that is very simplified, which leads to uncertainty. For example, in the creation and also in the outputs of a sea sequestration model. So, in this framework, how to take into account the heterogeneity and uncertainties of cost and potential mitigation option, and at what cost. So, with all these elements, we see that a simple tax on GHG's emission or even on net GHG's emissions will not be cost effective. And the problematic of my thesis is then how to deploy levers for GHG mitigation through the implementation of mitigation policies in face of trade-offs between the mitigation lever, heterogeneities and uncertainties related to the measurement of atmospheric GHGs and carbon sequestered, and to the non-permanence of carbon sequestered in agricultural soil. So to provide answer to this question, I will use an economic modeling approach. At the moment, I'm working on my first 2 articles. In the first, we determine the cost-effective timing for the adoption of agricultural mitigating practices in order to achieve the climate objectives of the agricultural sector. We develop a dynamic agricultural supply model maximizing farmers' revenue, subject to concern on net GHG emissions. And the second raises the question of the trade-off between monitoring costs and the uncertainties of carbon sequestered within the framework of payment policy per ton of carbon sequestered. If you have any questions, you can contact me at this email address. And thank you for your attention.